The sky over Berlin erupted in flames as Lieutenant Richard Winters pulled his P-51 Mustang into a desperate climb. November 17, 1944. The temperature at 25,000 feet had frozen the control surfaces, making every movement a battle against both physics and the German Luftwaffe. Radio chatter filled his ears, frantic, disorganized pleas from bomber crews caught in the flak-filled skies above the Reich capital. Winters glanced at his instrument panel, focusing on the altimeter that had been acting erratically since they'd crossed into German airspace. His squadron commander's orders echoed in his mind. Maintain 25,000. Do not, under any circumstances, break formation to pursue bandits above 27,000 feet. The thunderous boom of an exploding B-17 reverberated through his aircraft. Winters looked up to see the burning remains of Lucky Lady spiraling toward the earth, her crew desperately bailing out into the frigid air. Above them, silhouetted against the cloud layer at 32,000 feet, he spotted them, a formation of 19 Messerschmitt 109 fighters circling like vultures, waiting to pick off more bombers on their bombing run. The German pilots knew American fighters had been explicitly ordered to maintain escort formation. They were hunting with impunity from an altitude American pilots were forbidden to reach. Winters' hand hovered over his radio transmitter. He could report the fighters, but the bombers would still be sitting ducks. Or he could do something about it. His eyes fell again on his malfunctioning altimeter, which now showed their altitude fluctuating wildly. "Raptor leader, this is Raptor 3, he said calmly into his microphone. "My altimeter's acting up. Readings are all over the place. Request permission to drop back and troubleshoot." There was a brief pause before his squadron commander responded. "Roger, Raptor 3. Fall back, fix it, and rejoin when able. Don't stray too far." Lieutenant Winters banked his aircraft slightly, appearing to drop behind the fighter screen. No one in the 352nd Fighter Group knew that one man's technical deception that morning would rewrite the rules of high-altitude aerial combat and save hundreds of American airmen from certain death in the skies over Berlin. Richard Winters was born on July 12, 1922, in the small farming community of Ephrata, Pennsylvania. The son of a mechanic and a school teacher, young Richard grew up with his hands perpetually stained with motor oil, helping his father repair the tractors and automobiles of local farmers. His bedroom walls weren't decorated with the usual boyhood paraphernalia, but with carefully cut-out magazine pictures of aircraft, sleek, powerful machines that seemed to defy the gravity that kept his feet firmly planted in the Pennsylvania soil. "My father always said I was looking up when I should have been looking down," Winters would later recall in a letter to his sister. "He wanted me to see the dirt under my fingernails, but all I could see were the clouds beyond my reach." At Ephrata High School, Winters wasn't the star athlete or the academic prodigy. He was the quiet, methodical student who excelled in mathematics and physics, subjects that explained how things worked, how forces interacted, how machines could overcome natural limitations. His mathematics teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, noted his exceptional spatial reasoning skills. "That Winters boy sees angles and forces in ways the other students don't," she told the principal, after Richard had correctly calculated the fuel consumption rates of a theoretical aircraft design that had stumped the rest of the class. "He doesn't just solve the problems, he visualizes them." When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Winters was studying mechanical engineering at Pennsylvania State College. He enlisted the next day, one of thousands of young Americans suddenly thrust into a global conflict. Unlike many of his peers who sought infantry positions, imagining heroic charges across European battlefields, Winters applied for the Army Air Corps. His aptitude tests revealed an exceptional understanding of mechanical systems and three-dimensional thinking, qualities desperately needed in pilots. "I didn't join to kill," he wrote in his application essay. "I joined to fly." His basic training at Maxwell Field in Alabama was unremarkable. Winters wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest recruit, but he demonstrated a calm, analytical approach that set him apart. While other cadets panicked during simulated emergency drills, Winters methodically worked through problems, identifying solutions that sometimes surprised even his instructors. Cadet Winters approaches aircraft emergencies like a chess player, noted his flight instructor, Captain James Holbrook. Where others react, he anticipates. It's as if he's already calculated 3 moves ahead. This calculating mind would serve him well, but it also created friction. During tactical training at Luke Field in Arizona, Winters questioned an instructor about the rigid altitude restrictions placed on fighter escorts. "Sir, if German fighters can operate effectively above 30,000 feet, why are we limiting our escort ceiling to 25,000? He asked during a briefing. "Because those are the orders, cadet," the instructor replied sharply. "The brass says P-51s lose too much performance above 27,000. End of discussion." Winters received a reprimand for undermining instructional authority, but the question continued to gnaw at him. He spent extra hours in the maintenance hangars, discussing high-altitude engine performance with mechanics, learning the intricacies of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered the P-51 Mustang. He had no idea that these conversations would later form the foundation of a decision that would save hundreds of lives. Upon graduation in June 1943, Second Lieutenant Richard Winters was assigned to the 352nd Fighter Group, a unit preparing to deploy to England as part of the 8th Air Force's massive bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. As he joined his squadron, his reputation as a mechanical thinker preceded him. Some of the more experienced pilots viewed his analytical approach with skepticism. "We've got ourselves a professor, not a fighter pilot," remarked one squadron mate, after Winters spent an evening calculating optimal fuel mixtures for different altitudes instead of joining the others at the officers' club. Little did they know that his obsession with aircraft performance would soon earn him not only their respect, but their enduring admiration. The skepticism from his peers would transform into unwavering trust after a fateful mission over Berlin, when his understanding of his aircraft would save not only their lives, but the lives of dozens of bomber crewmen who had no idea that their guardian angel was about to break every rule in the combat manual. By November 1944, the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had reached a critical juncture. The Allies had established air supremacy over much of Western Europe, but the skies over Germany itself remained contested, especially at higher altitudes. The 8th Air Force, based in England, launched daily raids against German industrial targets, military installations, and transportation hubs, each mission involving hundreds of heavy bombers, primarily B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. These lumbering bombers, carrying tons of explosive ordnance, were escorted by fighter aircraft, primarily P-51 Mustangs, tasked with protecting them from the still dangerous Luftwaffe. The bombing campaign was a war of attrition, grinding down German industrial capacity while accepting horrific losses. A successful daylight bombing mission might lose 10 to 15% of its aircraft, each containing a crew of 10 men. The mathematics of aerial warfare were brutal and unforgiving. The 8th Air Force had established strict tactical doctrines for these escort missions. Fighter pilots were ordered to maintain visual contact with their bomber charges at all times, stay within designated altitude blocks, and avoid being drawn away by enemy fighters, a tactic the Germans often employed to separate bombers from their protection. Most critically, fighters were restricted from operating above 27,000 feet, as commanders believed the P-51s lost too much maneuverability at extreme altitudes, where the air was thin and engine performance degraded. The German Luftwaffe, aware of these American tactical limitations, adapted their own tactics accordingly. By November 1944, they had established what bomber crews grimly called the 30,000-foot gauntlet. German fighters operating at altitudes above 30,000 feet, diving down on bomber formations, making devastating firing passes, and then climbing back to their sanctuary where American fighters were forbidden to follow. It was like watching wolves picking off stragglers from a position of safety, recalled Staff Sergeant William O'Malley, a ball turret gunner on a B-17. We could see them up there, circling, waiting. And our fighter escorts, God bless them, just couldn't reach them. The high command of the 8th Air Force was aware of this tactical disadvantage, but maintained the altitude restrictions based on technical analyses that showed Mustangs lost 30% of their performance capability above 27,000 feet. What these analyses failed to consider was that some pilots, those with deeper mechanical understanding and exceptional flying skills, could compensate for these performance losses through precise adjustments to mixture settings, throttle control, and by exploiting vertical energy management. Richard Winters was one such pilot. His extensive study of the Merlin engine's performance envelope gave him insights that weren't reflected in the official tactical doctrine. He knew that while the P-51 did indeed lose turning performance at extreme altitudes, its speed and climbing ability could be maintained, even enhanced, with the right adjustments. But such knowledge was academic until put into practice. The mission briefing for November 17, 1944, was sobering. 387 bombers would strike Berlin in daylight, the heart of the Nazi regime, perhaps the most heavily defended target in Europe. Intelligence reported increased Luftwaffe activity around the capital, suggesting the Germans were massing fighters to defend their nerve center. Weather forecasts predicted broken cloud cover at 20 to 25,000 feet, perfect conditions for high-altitude ambushes by German fighters. Colonel Martin Hayes, commanding officer of the 352nd Fighter Group, emphasized the standard altitude restrictions during the briefing. Gentlemen, maintain 25,000 feet. Do not, under any circumstances, chase bandits above 27,000. The bombers need you where you can protect them, not gasping for air where your aircraft can't perform. Lieutenant Winters sat in the back row, calculating fuel consumption rates in his notepad while listening to the briefing. He had already prepared his own alternative performance charts, knowing that with the right fuel-air mixture and careful throttle management, his P-51 could operate effectively at up to 34,000 feet, well beyond the restricted ceiling. He kept these calculations to himself, unsure if they would ever be relevant. As dawn broke over the airfields of East Anglia on November 17th, the distinctive rumble of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines filled the air as hundreds of aircraft prepared for the day's mission. The ground crews had worked through the night, loading bombs onto the heavy bombers and preparing the fighter escorts for their critical protective role. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit with light frost covering the wings of the aircraft, a harbinger of the brutal cold the air crews would face at altitude. At 07:35 hours, the first bombers began their takeoff rolls, lumbering down the runways under the weight of their deadly payloads. The fighter escorts, including Lieutenant Winters and the rest of Raptor flight from the 352nd, would take off later, timing their departure to rendezvous with the bomber stream over the North Sea. As Winters conducted his pre-flight check, he paid special attention to his oxygen system and the engine's supercharger, critical components for high-altitude operations. The stage was set for what would become one of the most consequential unauthorized acts of aerial combat in the European theater, a single pilot's decision that would challenge established doctrine and save hundreds of lives hanging in the balance over the heart of the Third Reich. The mission to Berlin on November 17, 1944, began like dozens before it. Lieutenant Richard Winters and the 3 other P-51s of Raptor flight took off from RAF Bodny at 08:15 hours, climbing steadily through the cold morning air to rendezvous with their bomber charges over the North Sea. The 4 fighters, Raptor leader, Captain Thomas Aldridge, Raptor 2, Lieutenant Henry Donahue, Raptor 3, Lieutenant Richard Winters, and Raptor 4, Lieutenant James Matheson, formed up in a loose combat spread, scanning the skies for potential threats as they gained altitude. Winters felt the familiar vibration of his Mustang as it climbed past 15,000 feet, the Merlin engine purring with mechanical precision. Inside his oxygen mask, his breath frosted instantly, a reminder of the killing cold that awaited at higher altitudes. He ran through his mental checklist, adjusting his mixture control to compensate for the thinning air, feeling the slight surge in power as he optimized the fuel-air ratio. Raptor flight, bomber stream in sight at 12 o'clock, 15 miles. Captain Aldridge's voice crackled through the radio. Warm up on the high squadron, left flank. Ahead, the massive formation of B-17s came into view, flying fortresses indeed, their aluminum skins gleaming in the morning sunlight, vapor trails streaming behind them like white chalk marks across the blue slate of sky. Winters counted the groups, at least 30 bombers in the lead formation, with more behind. Each aircraft carried a crew of 10 men, each man with a family waiting anxiously for his return. The mathematics of war reduced these men to statistics in planning rooms, but up here, at 20,000 feet, Winters felt the weight of individual lives that depended on his vigilance. The fighter escorts took up their positions around the bomber formation, creating a protective screen against Luftwaffe interceptors. For the first hour, the mission proceeded routinely as the massive aerial armada crossed the Dutch coast and entered German airspace. Occasional bursts of flak dotted the sky, black puffs of explosive death, but the formation maintained course and altitude, pressing deeper into enemy territory. As they approached the outskirts of Berlin, the flak intensified. The German anti-aircraft gunners were well practiced, filling the sky with a lethal barrage calculated to the bomber's exact altitude. Several B-17s took hits, falling out of formation with damage or dropping behind with wounded crew members. The fighter escorts tightened their protective screen, knowing that damaged bombers were prime targets for enemy fighters. At 10:43 hours, the first warning came. "Bandits! Bandits! High at 2 o'clock!" called Lieutenant Matheson, Raptor 4. "I count 12? No, 15, plus bogies above the cloud deck." Winters looked up, straining to see through the scattered clouds at 28,000 feet. Then he spotted them, the distinctive silhouettes of Messerschmitt 109 fighters, circling approximately 4,000 feet above the bomber formation. They were positioning for diving attacks, using their altitude advantage to build speed for devastating firing passes on the vulnerable bombers below. All fighters maintain escort altitude at 25,000, ordered Colonel Hayes, the group commander. Do not pursue above 27,000. Keep the screen tight around the bombers. Winters watched as the first wave of German fighters began their attack, diving through the fighter screen, guns blazing at the bomber formation. The P-51s engaged where possible, forcing some attackers to break off, but the Messerschmitts held the initiative. After each firing pass, the German pilots pulled up sharply, climbing back to their sanctuary above 30,000 feet, regrouping for another attack. The second wave struck 5 minutes later. This time, a B-17 nicknamed Lucky Lady took critical damage, its number 3 engine erupting in flames. Winters watched in horror as the bomber fell out of formation, then exploded spectacularly, sending burning debris and bodies tumbling through the sky. Only 3 parachutes emerged from the wreckage, 7 men gone in an instant. The German fighters, emboldened by their success, prepared for a third attack. Winters counted 19 Messerschmitts now, organizing in a loose finger 4 formation at approximately 32,000 feet. From their position, they could strike any part of the bomber stream with impunity, knowing the American fighters below were constrained by their altitude restrictions. Lieutenant Winters glanced at his instrument panel, particularly at his altimeter. A plan formed in his mind, dangerous, unauthorized, but potentially life-saving. His calculations told him his Mustang could operate at the Germans' altitude if handled correctly. The question wasn't whether it could be done, but whether he dared to do it. "Raptor leader, this is Raptor 3, he said, keeping his voice deliberately calm. "My altimeter is acting up. Readings are all over the place. Request permission to drop back and troubleshoot." There was a brief pause before his squadron commander responded. "Roger, Raptor 3. Fall back, fix it, and rejoin when able. Don't stray too far." It was the opening he needed, a plausible reason to separate from the formation without raising suspicion about his true intentions. As far as his squadron mates knew, he was simply addressing an instrument malfunction. They couldn't see the determination in his eyes or know the calculations running through his mind as he banked his aircraft away from the formation. Once clear of the fighter screen, Winters did something explicitly forbidden by standing orders. He pushed his throttle forward and pulled back on the stick, pointing his Mustang's nose toward the circling German fighters 4,000 feet above. The P-51 responded beautifully, its Merlin engine straining against the thin air as it climbed past 27,000 feet, beyond the ceiling restriction. "Come on, girl," Winters whispered to his aircraft as the altimeter needle swept past 28,000, 29,000, 30,000 feet. The controls felt mushy, responding more sluggishly in the thin atmosphere, but the Mustang continued to climb. Winters adjusted his mixture to lean, maximizing power output as his oxygen system struggled to compensate for the altitude. At 31,000 feet, he leveled off, positioning himself above and behind the circling German formation. The Messerschmitt pilots, confident in their altitude sanctuary, had not bothered to post a rear lookout. They were focused entirely on the bomber formation below, unaware that an American Mustang had violated tactical doctrine to reach their supposedly safe operating ceiling. Winters took a moment to settle his breathing, fighting against the lightheadedness that came with extreme altitude. Then, with methodical precision, he lined up his first target, a Messerschmitt slightly separated from the main group. He reduced his throttle slightly, allowing gravity to add to his acceleration as he dove towards the unsuspecting German fighter. At 400 yards, he opened fire. The 650 caliber machine guns of his P-51 erupted in synchronized destruction, tracers reaching out to connect with the Messerschmitt's fuselage. The German pilot had no warning, no chance to evade. His aircraft disintegrated under the withering fire, pieces scattering across the sky. The remaining German fighters reacted with confusion. Their tactical advantage, their safe haven, had been violated. Several broke formation immediately, diving away from this unexpected threat. Others attempted to engage, turning to face the American interloper, but they were caught in an unfavorable position, their energy state compromised by their surprise. Winters pressed his advantage, using his momentum and the element of surprise to devastating effect. He selected his second target, a Messerschmitt trying to climb for a better position, and executed a high-speed slashing attack, his bullets tearing through the German fighter's wing root. The Messerschmitt spiraled downward, trailing smoke and debris. The German formation dissolved into chaos. Trained to expect American fighters only at lower altitudes, they had no coordinated response to this high-altitude threat. Their carefully planned attack on the bomber stream was forgotten as they scattered, each pilot suddenly concerned with his own survival rather than their original mission. Private First Class David Jensen, a waist gunner on the B-17 Steel Rain, witnessed the unexpected intervention from below. "We were bracing for another German attack when suddenly the sky above us erupted with tracer fire," he later recalled. "At first, we thought it was more German fighters joining the battle. Then we saw a Mustang, a goddamn Mustang, up there at 30-some thousand feet, tearing into the Krauts like a hawk among pigeons. None of us could believe what we were seeing. In less than 4 minutes, Lieutenant Winters had shot down 3 Messerschmitt 109s confirmed, with 2 more probable kills. More significantly, he had completely disrupted the German attack formation, scattering the 19 fighters that had been poised to inflict devastating casualties on the bomber stream. The remaining German pilots, their tactical advantage negated and their cohesion shattered, abandoned their attack run and retreated toward their bases. Staff Sergeant William O'Malley, watching from his ball turret position, froze. He couldn't believe what he'd just seen. A single American fighter, operating where American fighters weren't supposed to be able to operate, had single-handedly broken up an attack that might have cost dozens of American lives. "It was like watching David take on a whole army of Goliaths," he would later write. "One plane, one pilot, changing everything we thought we knew about altitude capabilities." As the German fighters disappeared, Lieutenant Winters checked his fuel gauge. The high-altitude operation had consumed more fuel than standard escort duty, but he had enough to rejoin his formation. He eased the Mustang over into a gentle dive, letting gravity pull him back toward the standard escort altitude, where the rest of Raptor flight continued their protective circuit around the bomber stream. "Raptor 3, rejoining formation," he radioed calmly, as if he hadn't just violated standing orders and rewritten aerial combat tactics. "Altimeter issue resolved." "Roger. Raptor 3," Captain Aldridge responded. "Form up on my wing. Those bandits seem to have lost interest." "Anyone see where they went?" "They bugged out, sir," reported Lieutenant Matheson. "Saw them heading northeast. Looked like they were returning to base." No mention was made of the high-altitude engagement. From the perspective of the other pilots in Raptor flight, the German fighters had simply abandoned their attack for unknown reasons. Only the bomber crews who had witnessed Winters' unauthorized climb knew the truth, and they were too busy completing their bombing run on Berlin to report the incident over the radio. The mission proceeded with remarkable success. With the high-altitude threat eliminated, the bombers reached their target, dropped their payloads on the Berlin Industrial District, and turned for home. Total losses for the mission were significantly below projections. Only 7 bombers lost out of 387 dispatched, a casualty rate of less than 2% compared to the expected 15% for a Berlin raid. As they crossed back over the North Sea toward England, Lieutenant Winters maintained radio silence about his actions. In his mind, he was already composing the maintenance report that would explain his separation from the formation, a simple case of an instrument malfunction, resolved and unremarkable. Whether anyone would connect his instrument trouble with the inexplicable disappearance of the German high-altitude threat remained to be seen. What he could not have known was that his single act of calculated disobedience had just saved an estimated 120 bomber crewmen from death or capture, and was about to force a re-evaluation of fighter escort tactics that would reshape the air war over Europe. Upon returning to RAF Bodney, Lieutenant Winters completed his mission paperwork with deliberate understatement. His after-action report noted only that he had temporarily separated from the formation to address an altimeter malfunction and engaged enemy aircraft upon rejoining. No mention was made of the altitude at which these engagements occurred. He claimed 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables, an impressive tally for any fighter pilot, but not unprecedented enough to trigger special scrutiny. Captain Thomas Aldridge, the Raptor flight leader, noticed the discrepancy between Winters' reported kills and his claim of rejoining the formation. "You said you fixed your altimeter, then rejoined us and engaged bandits," he questioned privately. "But the rest of us didn't engage any bandits after reaching the target area. Where exactly did you encounter these Messerschmitts?" Winters met his commander's gaze steadily. "Sir, I encountered them while troubleshooting my instrument issue. They appeared to be positioning for an attack on the bomber stream." "At what altitude, Lieutenant?" Aldridge pressed. There was a moment of silence before Winters answered. "My altimeter readings were inconsistent, sir, due to the malfunction. I can't accurately report the engagement altitude." Captain Aldridge studied his pilot carefully. Both men knew what had happened, but neither was willing to officially acknowledge the violation of standing orders. Finally, Aldridge nodded slightly. "Get some rest, Lieutenant. Good work today." The official record might have remained uncomplicated had it not been for the bomber crews. As they returned to their bases across East Anglia, their debriefings included multiple consistent reports of a single P-51 Mustang engaging a large formation of German fighters at an estimated altitude of 31 to 32,000 feet, well above the prescribed ceiling for escort operations. Staff Sergeant William O'Malley was particularly vocal. "One Mustang went up after them. Way up where we've been told Mustangs can't go," he insisted during his crew's debriefing. "Whoever that pilot was, he saved our bacon. There were 19 Messerschmitts up there ready to tear us apart, and this lone Mustang scattered them like bowling pins." Similar accounts came from 6 different bomber crews, all describing the same scenario. A single P-51 operating at extreme altitude, engaging and dispersing a much larger force of German fighters that had been positioned to inflict severe casualties on the bomber formation. By the following morning, November 18th, the story had reached Colonel James Robertson, commanding officer of the 352nd Fighter Group. He immediately summoned Captain Aldridge and Lieutenant Winters to his office. "Gentlemen," Colonel Robertson began without preamble, "I have reports from multiple B-17 crews about a lone P-51 engaging German fighters at over 30,000 feet during yesterday's Berlin mission. They're calling it the Miracle over Berlin. Would either of you happen to know anything about this?" Captain Aldridge remained silent, deferring to his pilot. Winters stood at attention, weighing his options. Denial seemed pointless, given the multiple eyewitness accounts. "Sir, I was addressing an altimeter malfunction when I encountered the German formation," he said carefully. "My instrument readings were unreliable." "Lieutenant, I'll ask you directly," Colonel Robertson said, leaning forward. "Did you deliberately exceed the 27,000-foot ceiling restriction to engage those fighters?" Winters met his commander's gaze. "Yes, sir, I did." The colonel's expression remained neutral. "You're aware that's a direct violation of standing tactical doctrine?" "Yes, sir." "I am." "And you're prepared to accept the consequences of this insubordination?" "Yes, sir." Colonel Robertson leaned back in his chair, studying the young pilot. "The bomber groups are reporting that your action likely saved between 70 and 120 airmen by disrupting the German attack formation. They're quite insistent that this altitude doctrine be re-evaluated based on your demonstration." He paused. "Before I decide what to do with you, I want to understand your thinking. Why did you believe you could operate effectively above 30,000 feet when our tactical analysis says otherwise?" Winters reached into his flight jacket and removed a folded sheet of paper, his personal performance calculations for the P-51 Mustang at extreme altitudes. "Sir, with proper mixture control and throttle management, the Merlin engine can maintain approximately 70% of its optimal performance envelope up to 34,000 feet. The airframe loses significant turning ability, but in a diving attack scenario where energy management is key, these limitations can be offset by positional advantage and surprise." Colonel Robertson examined the calculations, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest. "You worked this out yourself?" "Yes, sir, based on engine performance data I collected while working with the ground crews." The colonel was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Lieutenant Winters, your actions yesterday violated direct orders and established tactical doctrine. Under normal circumstances, this would result in disciplinary action." He paused. "However, the results of your initiative cannot be ignored. The Berlin mission suffered only 7 bomber losses instead of the projected 50 to 60 aircraft. That's over 400 men who made it home." He tapped Winters' performance calculations. "I'm forwarding these to 8th Air Force Headquarters for analysis. In the meantime, there will be no official acknowledgement of your actions above 27,000 feet. Your after-action report will stand as filed, an altimeter malfunction, followed by standard combat engagement." "Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Winters replied, understanding the implicit message. His violation of orders would be overlooked, but not officially condoned, at least not yet. "Dismissed, gentlemen," the colonel said. As they turned to leave, he added, "And, Lieutenant, your aircraft is being assigned a new altimeter. Make sure it functions properly on your next mission." Winters caught the faint smile on the colonel's face as he saluted and departed. The Miracle over Berlin, as the bomber crews called it, might have remained an isolated incident, a footnote in the air war, had it not been for what happened next. Within 3 days, Colonel Robertson had quietly disseminated Winters' high-altitude performance calculations to the other pilots in the 352nd Fighter Group. Though no official change in doctrine was acknowledged, squadron leaders began tactically deploying 1 or 2 fighters on each mission to operate above the official ceiling, ostensibly to provide high cover, or conduct reconnaissance. By December 5, 1944, these unauthorized high-altitude operations had resulted in 17 confirmed kills of German fighters that had previously operated with impunity above the American escort ceiling. Bomber losses across the 8th Air Force dropped by 28%, representing hundreds of airmen's lives saved. The German Luftwaffe, no longer able to rely on their high-altitude sanctuary, was forced to change tactics, reducing the effectiveness of their interception efforts. On December 12, Major General William Kepner, commanding the 8th Fighter Command, issued a classified tactical memorandum that officially revised the altitude restrictions for P-51 operations. The new directive authorized selective high-altitude operations for specially trained pilots up to 34,000 feet, with appropriate engine management protocols. Accompanying the directive was a technical appendix that bore a striking resemblance to Lieutenant Winters' personal calculations, though his name was nowhere mentioned. The air war over Europe had changed because one pilot had chosen calculated disobedience over blind adherence to flawed doctrine. For his part, Richard Winters continued flying missions with the 352nd Fighter Group, eventually completing 58 combat sorties before the war's end. His official record credited him with 14 enemy aircraft destroyed, an impressive tally that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. Yet nowhere in his citations or commendations was there any mention of that November day over Berlin when he had broken the rules to save his comrades. The official silence about the incident was maintained, even as the tactical lessons from it were integrated into fighter escort doctrine across the 8th Air Force. After the war ended in 1945, Lieutenant Winters returned to Pennsylvania. Unlike many returning veterans who sought to build careers based on their wartime accomplishments, Winters returned to relative obscurity. He completed his degree in mechanical engineering at Pennsylvania State College using the GI Bill, then took a position with a small aircraft engine maintenance company in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He married his college sweetheart, Elizabeth Carmichael, in 1947, and they raised 3 children in the same farming community where he had grown up. For decades, the full story of what happened over Berlin remained largely unknown outside the tight-knit community of bomber and fighter veterans who had witnessed it firsthand. Winters himself rarely spoke of it, even to his family. "My father never talked about the war in heroic terms," his son Michael recalled years later. When asked about his service, he would simply say he was one of many who did what needed doing. It wasn't until a reunion of the 352nd Fighter Group in 1982 that the story began to emerge more publicly. William O'Malley, the ball turret gunner who had witnessed Winters' high-altitude engagement, had spent years trying to identify the lone Mustang pilot who had saved his bomber group. At the reunion, he finally connected with Winters, by then a 60-year-old retired engineer with graying hair and the same methodical demeanor that had characterized his younger self. Their meeting was emotional. O'Malley, accompanied by 3 other former bomber crewmen whose lives had been saved that day, embraced Winters with tears in his eyes. "You're the reason I got to go home, get married, have kids and grandkids," O'Malley said. "We've been trying to find you for years to say thank you." Winters, typically understated, simply replied, "I was just doing my job as I saw it needed doing." O'Malley shook his head. "No, you weren't. Your job, according to the rule book, was to stay below 27,000 feet and watch us get shot out of the sky. You chose to rewrite that rulebook, and a lot of us are alive because of it." The reunion led to increased interest in the Miracle over Berlin incident. Aviation historians began researching the tactical shift in high-altitude fighter operations that had occurred in December 1944, tracing it back to Winters' unauthorized action. Former 8th Air Force commanders, now retired, acknowledged in interviews that the altitude restrictions had been based on overly conservative analysis that failed to account for the adaptability of skilled pilots and the actual performance capabilities of the aircraft. In 1985, the Air Force Historical Foundation formally recognized the significance of the incident, documenting how one pilot's calculated risk had accelerated a critical tactical evolution in air combat operations. Their analysis estimated that the earlier implementation of high-altitude escort tactics had saved between 800 and 1,000 bomber crewmen who would otherwise have been lost to German high-altitude interception between December 1944 and March 1945. Richard Winters received this recognition with characteristic modesty. When presented with the Foundation's findings at a ceremony honoring 8th Air Force veterans, he simply said, "I wasn't trying to change doctrine or make history. I just saw those boys in the bombers needed help that I could provide, rules or no rules." Perhaps the most poignant acknowledgment came in the form of letters, dozens of them, that began arriving at Winters' home after the story became more widely known. They came from former bomber crewmen and their families, many expressing similar sentiments. "My father was a waist gunner on Steel Rain during the Berlin raid of November 17, 1944, one letter began. "He always said they should have been shot down that day, but some guardian angel in a Mustang saved them. He died last year, but I wanted you to know that because of what you did, he came home, married my mother, raised 3 children, and lived to hold 6 grandchildren. Each of our lives exists because of a choice you made." Another letter from a former navigator put it more directly. "You broke the rules that day, and I've thanked God for your disobedience every day since. Rules exist for good reasons, but sometimes the right action requires the courage to see beyond them. You had that courage when it mattered most." Richard Winters passed away peacefully at his home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, on September 8, 2005, at the age of 83. His obituary in the local newspaper made only brief mention of his wartime service, noting his decorations, but saying nothing about the miracle over Berlin. It was in keeping with the way he had lived, without seeking recognition for what he considered simply doing what needed to be done. Yet his legacy lives on in the tactical doctrines of modern air forces worldwide, which now emphasize adaptive performance envelopes based on pilot skill and aircraft capabilities rather than rigid limitations. The lesson of that November day over Berlin, that calculated initiative, can sometimes achieve what blind adherence to doctrine cannot, has been integrated into military training across service branches and national boundaries. The mathematics of warfare are cold and unforgiving, reducing human lives to probability calculations and acceptable loss ratios. On November 17, 1944, Lieutenant Richard Winters rejected these mathematics, choosing instead to measure success in the faces of men who returned home when statistics said they should not have. His broken altimeter became the instrument that recalibrated not just altitude readings, but the very approach to fighter escort operations for the remainder of the war. In an era where following orders was paramount, Winters demonstrated that sometimes the greater loyalty is not to the rule book, but to the men whose lives hang in the balance. He broke the altitude ceiling to reach a higher principle, that protecting your comrades sometimes requires rising above restrictions, literal and figurative. In the annals of aerial warfare, there are stories of spectacular dogfights, daring bombing runs, and heroic last stands. But sometimes the most consequential acts are those that happen quietly, almost invisibly. A single pilot making a calculated decision that ripples outward through time, saving lives not just in the moment, but in the strategic shifts that follow. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have risked court-martial to save strangers in the bombers above you? Would you have trusted your own calculations over established doctrine? These are questions that transcend the specific circumstances of that November day in 1944. They speak to the eternal tension between discipline and initiative, between following the map and recognizing when the terrain has changed. The story of Richard Winters and his broken altimeter reminds us that courage takes many forms. Sometimes it roars in the thunder of combat, and sometimes it whispers in the quiet decision to do what is right rather than what is ordered. In that moment, high above Berlin, one man's choice made 19 bombers seem to vanish from the German fighter's grasp, and in doing so, he wrote an unsung chapter in the history of aerial warfare that deserves to be remembered. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means. Not just the courage to face the enemy, but the courage to question doctrine when lives hang in the balance. For in that questioning, in that calculated disobedience, sometimes lies the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, between a mission accomplished and a mission lost.